Thanks very much, Ken. So it's a great pleasure for me to be back in Atlanta and at the High and to give the last of the three lectures on the future of the museum. I would like to thank Michael Shapiro, obviously, of the High Museum, and also David Brenneman, Patricia Rodeval, and Virginia Shearer, with whom I've worked over the last few months and got further and further, I hope, into thinking about the issues which interest us this evening. But I want in particular to recognize my students in an American culture course who forced me to think a bit more precisely about some of the issues we're going to be talking about today, and also the colleagues and the students in the design studio that I was involved in last fall. My presentation today will be in three parts. The first one, in fact, will probably be the longest one. And it's entitled The Museum with a question mark. It seems to me that if we're thinking about the future of the museum, we need to think in the first place about what the museum is for us. In other words, I'm going to be discussing and trying to define the idea of a museum as it exists today and as perhaps it can be reinvented and probably needs to be reinvented hopefully in the near future. And once I've explained that situation, I will touch on the conceptual dimensions also announced in my title and talk, amongst others, of Emerson and Simondon. I will be discussing a series of philosophers and/or theoreticians. In the title of this lecture, I put deliberately an American author who one might think of being totally antithetical to the very notion of the museum, and a French philosopher of the 1960s and 70s who is not very well known in America, but whose work is starting to be influential in France, and I will try to explain briefly why I think we should devote more attention to his work. And then finally I will rapidly try to contextualize my take on the work we did in the design studio with Sarah and Ken and graduate students last fall, and talk very quickly about the virtual museum. So my first question is, why question the notion of the museum? At the end of the fall semester, the design studio in which I was involved produced a short demonstration and, as the tradition has it, a poster. This is the first version of the poster. It's not the final version, which I will show you in a second. This is the first version of the poster, which questions the interaction between new technologies and a well-known instance of traditional museum culture. But what I want to concentrate on in the first place is my curious mistranslation of the future of the museum. Kent Nespel asked me to provide a French tag in honor of the Louvre Atlanta connection, and trying to translate future of the museum poses a double problem. First of all, that future in French is a verb tense and not future time. In French we have avenir. And secondly, the power of the French language to essentialize things by the use of the definite article. So it's precisely in order to question what museums are and therefore what future one can invent for them, the question of what, to use a Deleuzian turn of phrase which translates very badly into English, what the becoming of the museum could be. And Musée Avenir seems to me to be more supple in many ways than the future of the museum. My first question is, after showing you the other version of our poster. My first question is, how can one speak of the museum, granted the history over the last couple of centuries of museums in the plural? Is, for example, to look at 2 or 3 empirical questions. When a museum, such as the Hive, looks like this in the 1920s, looks like this at the end of the 1980s, looks like this in the early 21st century, is it still the same museum? Does the architectural nature of the museum not impinge fairly radically on what the museum is? And of course, there's a long tradition of the last couple of centuries of asking these questions. If I take, for example, the National Museum in Washington, and if I set alongside it the Louvre in Paris, I immediately see a canonical example of a simple cultural fact that in many countries, Britain, the USA, Canada, Germany, but not in France and not in Italy, museums are housed in buildings that were specifically built for them. Whereas in France, until a recent wave of contemporary museums were almost exclusively housed in historical buildings seized from the crown or the aristocracy during the French Revolution. However, if I compare the National Gallery in Washington with another Washington museum, the Phillips Collection, I have a similar sort of look in the architecture. Well, one is classically inspired, the other is Neo-Georgian. But I have a difference in scale, about which I'll talk in a second. And I have a museum for the Phillips Collection, which is housed in the dwelling originally of its creator. Or if, to take another example, I compare the Museum of Art in Philadelphia, which opened in the late 1920s, with the building of the Barnes Collection, which opened a few years earlier, replicating the chronology of the Phillips Collection, 1921, and the National Gallery in Washington, which wasn't completed until the very early years of the 1940s, if I remember rightly. Here, once again, although the architectural references are not exactly the same, we have purpose-built museums referring to a long tradition of European classical or Renaissance, etc., architecture. So my question is, first of all, between the French Museum, housed in a building seized from the crown or the aristocracy, and in the purpose-built English, American, German, etc. museums, is it the same agenda or is it a different agenda? I'll come back to that question in a second. Or if I get back, or rather if I come now to the National Gallery in London and look at a different question, but a related question, the question of the size of the museum. You see that when the English Parliament created the National Gallery in the early 1820s, based on a collection given by an English aristocrat, in the same way that the important public museums in the USA are based on collections given by distinguished collectors. The press in London very quickly started comparing unfavorably the house in Pall Mall, where the National Gallery was housed, and the Louvre in Paris, whose dimensions it greatly exaggerated. And a press campaign forced the Parliament quite rapidly to vote the necessary funds for the National Gallery as we know it now, and which looks very much like the Philadelphia Art Museum or the National Gallery in Washington. Very quickly, Parliament released the necessary funds for the National Gallery in Trafalgar Square to be built. The question of dimension, of size, is already a question of the national agenda pursued in museum building. But there are other questions as well. If I could come back to Washington, I compare the Phillips collection and the National Gallery. The Phillips collection, as I said, started and opened 20 years before the National Gallery. Phillips, when he opened his museum, militantly stated that the advantage of a small, domestic-sized museum was that it engaged the visitors directly, encouraged them to come back, allowed them to sit and contemplate, and did not try to overawe them, as did major American museums of the time. And Phillips was very ironic about the major museums which tried to overawe the public and simultaneously attract them with cheap enticements, and also privilege the institution and the grandeur of the institution over their non-existent or all too scant collections. This, of course, is the interior of the entrance to the National Gallery in Washington, and of course the same logic persists as the East Building is added to the West Wing some decades later. Can we speak about the museum when we have museums which are private foundations and museums which are public institutions, when we know that until very recently the idea that a museum which is a private foundation can be significant and not simply mercenary was impossible in France and is still highly debated. In France, it goes without saying almost that significant cultural institutions must be public institutions. Countries where foundations are almost unthinkable, countries where foundations coexist with national or municipal structures which were created by private initiative rather than public initiative, as in the States. Are these things the same museum? Or, even if the museums look the same, as is the case of the National Gallery and the Barnes Foundation, are in the same spirit, does one have the same museum when you have a traditional art historical hanging, as here in one of the rooms of the National Museum, the National Gallery in Washington, where you have a series of landscapes which are displayed from left to right, more or less chronologically, and in which the Valenciennes cloud study and the Constable cloud study look at each other across a diagonal and write implicitly, for those of us who know, the history of painting as a moment in the prehistory of photography. Both Valenciennes' cloud studies and Constable's cloud studies have, over the last 20, 25 years, been consistently used to explore the rise and the cultural enabling of instantaneous photography. So here we have, silently but very clearly, an art historical hanging. If I go now to the Barnes collection, we have, famously, a totally non-art historical hanging. It so happens that most of Barnes' paintings are impressionist or post-impressionist, but there are Titians and primitive works of art mingled with the Renoirs and the Cézannes. It's difficult to get illustrations of the Barnes collection. For a long time, they were banned. For a long time, you could only get hold of black and white photos. But if you look at this hanging with the Seurat top and the Cézanne at the bottom, you'll see that there are no signs giving any sort of art historical information. For a very long time, the Barnes collection deliberately did not have a reputable art historical catalogue. You have here metalwork, as you have throughout all the rooms. You have systematically very balanced hangings, and you have basically works assembled so that there are chromatic or formal echoes between them, between the nude model, the legs of the nude model and the legs of the card player. Obvious and buttressed by the generally Freudian tone of much of Barnes's writings on the psychology of art appreciation, but also, perhaps more interestingly, the balancing of the Cézanne nude and the Cézanne still life, or more simplistically, the two portraits which are looking in opposite directions. In other words, here we have a museum which is not an art historical museum. How can we speak of the museum when reputable, well-established museums can be either, as mainstream museums are, strongly, significantly art historical, and others are militantly non-art historical? That is the question I want to raise. And quickly, to suggest it is not purely and simply a theoretical question, but it's also a real and an actual question, a question which is raised, amongst other places, here in the High. Once we've seen two poles of hanging, and both of which would merit a long, detailed, descriptive and theoretical study, what do we make of this extremely bold presentation of busts currently at Louvre Atlanta? Or the curious presence of a giant Napoleon in an exhibition devoted to kings as collectors. What does that say about the translation of parts of the Louvre collection to Atlanta? Or again, what about the juxtaposition of two well-known Spanish painters? Sorry? I know, the two well-known Spanish painters were on the other wall. Or in this room, to speak about the paintings which a lot of my compatriots back in France regret, to put it mildly, having seen sent to Atlanta for a few months. This Raphael is now being replaced by Poussin's Et in Arcadiuego. The drawing and painting by Régnier are still there, and opposite what is now the Poussin, we have the Rembrandt of the angel dictating the Gospels to one of the Gospel writers. What happens when you have a hanging like that? Dictation of the Gospel. The Gospel writer with a pencil in hand. The pencil drawing, the man obviously, and the color represented by a woman. And then, now in the place of Castiglione, Poussin's Et in Arcadiuego where the finger is drawing, is retracing the lettering as it reads, and the figure of the woman is standing mysteriously by the side. It seems to me that by the confrontation of these three paintings, there is implicitly some sort of philosophical or theoretical fiction going on about painting, writing, reading, drawing, and colouring. What is a museum when it does that? Even as it follows an art historical agenda by presenting the French kings as significant figures in the history of collecting. That is the empirical evidence that I wanted to start with in order to present my topic. And from now on, I'm afraid there'll be no more images, and you'll just have to listen to me. My primary concern, in the first place, is to question the opposition between clear art historical museums and the other museums, the Barnes, the Phillips collection. Setting aside, for the time being at least, the fact that the non-art historical museums amongst those I've shown are museums involved with the incorporation into American culture of what was seen as modernist French painting at the time, both the Barnes and the Phillips having important collections of French Impressionist and Post-Impressionist paintings, but at the same time being very much involved in drawing young American painters into that ambiance. If one thinks of the French Museum, what in France is still known as the Universal Museum. The Louvre, as everyone knows, is considered in French culture as being the Universal Museum. And recently, even in an article in the press, a former French Minister of Culture congratulated himself, and my culture in general, on exporting to Atlanta, obviously, but also to the Middle East, the knowledge, the know-how, and the universal culture that incarnated by France. A couple of years ago, I remember hearing a French politician saying that it was the vocation of French culture to be universal, which is something I find increasingly difficult to take for a variety of reasons to which I shall go. But obviously, the idea that French culture is universal, that the French Museum is the universal museum, goes back to the creation of the Louvre, anticipated in the last years of the monarchy, but brought into effect meaningfully and really opened after the Revolution, and significantly only taking on real grandeur under Napoleon, in the first years of the 19th century. The idea was that the museum was part of a revolutionary Enlightenment project, and that you used the objects of regal propaganda, of regal obfuscation of sensibilities. You used the objects of religious rites and therefore of obscurantist practices, and you integrated them into the march of reason. And therefore, the fact that the Louvre ceased to be a royal palace and became the Universal Museum was the very embodiment of the march of reason. If I then take the opposite extreme, the Phillips collection, or even more the Barnes collection, militantly anti-historical, what happens there is, quite explicitly, in the writings of Barnes, in the writings of Phillips, in the writing of Dewey, with whom Barnes worked, is the notion of the aesthetic experience as a universal democratic experience. In other words, our universals are not the universals of reason, they're the universals of feeling and of acting. In other words, if I take the two extremes, the Louvre and the Barnes collection, and if nevertheless I take into account that museums like the National Gallery in Washington are a bit of both, or that big public museums in the USA are a bit of both, strongly art historical, but not exclusively so, in such a way, in fact, that French cultural functionaries fail to understand it. For example, when I get my students at the Ecole du Louvre to read even the introductions to guidebooks to American museums, and I remember a couple of years ago showing these students who are preparing to become or to enter the school which will turn them into the next generation of senior French visual arts functionaries. They will be running the Ministry of Culture in the visual arts side within 15 or 20 years. I show them, for example, the preface to the guidebook to the Art Institute of Chicago. And there's a short passage about the architecture, and then the director speaks about the guidebook, hoping that it will help visitors to experience the art more fully and help them to have a more exciting visit to the museum. I show this to the next generation of senior civil servants in the Ministry of Culture in France, and they tell me, this is scandalous, this is not a museum. Museums aren't for this. And I say, what are museums for? They're for art history. Why do you go to a museum? You go to learn art history. And when I show them a document about the Barnes collection, and I insist on the fact that Barnes was adamant that his foundation was not a museum, which is why it had no proper catalogue, which is why the hanging, which he decided was meant to remain forever unchanged. And I say to these students, Barnes says that going to his museum, his foundation, is not visiting a museum, it's having an educational experience. What sort of educational experience? And automatically they answer me, art historical. And I say, well, how can you go to an institution which doesn't hang the works historically, which doesn't have a catalogue, which for years didn't even have proper reproductions, which didn't even know how many works it had? How can you learn art history? And the fact is, it's practically impossible for them to understand that there is an approach to art which considers the aesthetic experience as being itself educational. So it seems to me that if you look at the major museums and at experiments with museums over the last couple of centuries, since museums started to take root in the late 18th, throughout the 19th and into the 20th century, we have this opposition between what I will say a bit programmatically, what I will call a bit programmatically, the French universal approach, the museum as the instrument of reason, of the progressive reason, and the Anglo-American approach, grounded in empiricism, grounded in pragmatism, as of the museum as a place of significant experience. At the Louvre, you have a school attached, the Ecole du Louvre, which was created in the late 19th century as a place to help people acquire the cultural codes which allowed them to understand the painting. The Barnes Foundation, as you probably know, is attached to Abraham Lincoln University, the first black university created in the 19th century for African Americans. A school, therefore, devoted to the underprivileged. A school which trains doctors, scientists, managers, lawyers, and has no significant humanities department. On the French side, we have the idea of the march of reason requiring knowledge. On the Anglo-American side, we have the idea of the aesthetic experience as significant, as good for you. Barnes initially hung some of his paintings in his factory because they were good for his workers. So we have, in the history of museums in the plural, therefore, it seems to me, attention, two poles. On the one side, sensibility, on the other side, reason. On the other one side, what is very often private experience, individual experience. On the other side, public knowledge. French museums exist chiefly, it seems to me, in order to allow people to show signs of cultural knowledge which are very closely integrated with social status. On the one hand, you have embodied experience. On the other hand, you have symbolic knowledge. Or perhaps, to use two of the categories that Barbara Stafford used here a few weeks ago, on the one hand, you have a distributed notion of consciousness. On the other hand, you have what Barbara Stafford described, referring to the recent history of cognitive science as the decade of the brain. Museums have historically been divided between the brain and the body, reason and the sensibility. So they are readily opposed in that way. But on the other hand, these two logics, these two dynamics, grew up at the same time. And I suggest that they grew up. They started to be formed in the 18th century. They developed throughout the 19th and the 20th century as essentially disciplinary functions. In other words, the museum is a disciplinary institution. It's a disciplinary institution because reason is one discipline. Sensibility is also, or learning, the universal language of sensibility, as Barnes would say, or as Phillips would say, is something you learn. It is also a discipline in the academic sense. If you go, for example, to the public exhibition in the Library of Congress in Washington, it is explained to you as you enter that the exhibits are divided into three categories, which they claim to derive directly from Jefferson: reason, imagination, and history. Three disciplines, three capacities which need to be trained to make a well-formed, democratic American citizen. So these are academic disciplines. But I would also say that they are disciplines in the sense that Michel Foucault uses. In other words, they are training people, they are formatting people, they are normalizing people. You go to the museum and you learn to adopt certain norms. In France, it's a social cultural norm, very obviously still today. In America, in Britain, it's much more a norm of sensible response. More and more, these two dynamics have been merging, it seems to me, in museums. It would seem, for example, that the opposition that you have between the way the public is greeted and guided in American museums by people called docents, who are ordinary people, not specialists, but who have, of course, some training, but who are basically sharing what is common. Whereas in France, if you want to show people publicly around the Louvre, if you want to have what is called a droit de parole, be allowed to speak out loud in the Louvre, you have to be a licensed guide. And the training that is required is art historical training. Okay, so there is an opposition, it seems to me, between docent volunteers and licensed guides, which reflects what I've been talking about. But if you listen to them, if you listen to the guides in the Louvre, or you listen to the docents in American museums, you'll find that they're now speaking the same language. A little popular art history and a lot of sentiment. Even at the Barnes Foundation, I was at the Barnes Foundation 10 days ago, and there was a docent giving almost a strict art historical tour of the collections of the Barnes Foundation. I imagine that poor old Barnes was turning in his grave all the time because it was precisely the kind of thing that he refused. He created his foundation to do something else. So there has been a merging of the discipline of sensibility and the discipline of knowledge, which it will take a bit of time to demonstrate it, but seems to me to be very much in step with the development of education since the 18th century and into modern and post or late modern times. So we have this, beyond the initial opposition, the fact that we're dealing with disciplines, and therefore they are potentially congruent. However, it seems to me there's another significant difference. If I come back to my idea that discipline is to be understood in Michel Foucault's sense of forming, normalizing subjectivities. In other words, that societies today no longer function chiefly according to laws and to questions of power, regal power, legal power, but function according to the imposition in the first place in disciplinary societies and the self-imposition today of norms. We all, perhaps even by the fact that we're going to museums, Michel Foucault would suggest, we are accepting, anticipating, normalizing ourselves. In other words, museums are an important part of what Foucault calls biopolitics. And the interesting stage, the important stage of biopolitics, as formulated by Foucault and then clarified, I feel, by Gilles Deleuze, is that the societies of discipline, to which the museum belongs to a certain extent, have given way to societies of control. We are no longer in places, schools are no longer officially places where everyone is under the eye of the teacher and the teacher is looking at the pupils and the pupils are looking at the teacher. Schools are places where increasingly one is meant to learn in a more open, disseminated fashion. It seems to me that museums were places that anticipated this from the start, and that museums were presented in disciplinary terms, but in fact were perhaps essential cogs in the invention of sensibility and the invention of normatizing society as opposed to disciplined societies in which norms were imposed, societies where we learn to develop our own normatized behaviors. And it seems to me that today, when an institution like the Louvre admits that its art historical approach doesn't speak to its visitors. Henri Loiret, when he opened the Louvre Atlanta exhibition last September, explicitly said so, that most visitors didn't see the art historical information, and the few that did see it didn't find it useful. It seems to me that that French universalizing through reason has largely run its course. Postmodernism is, as everyone knows, one of the ways of expressing that fact. Unfortunately, perhaps, the other universalizing function, that of sentiment, is perhaps stronger than ever today. Barbara Stafford spoke here a few weeks ago about tailored media. In other words, media in which the experience is explicitly tailored to the individual sensibility. The French philosopher and theoretician of technologies has written at length about the way that the music industry tailors the sensibility, that people no longer live in a complex time field when they listen to music, but are instantly have their imagination captured by the technology of the music industry and also the television industry. And Stigler has often quoted the director of the main French television channel saying that the job of television is to create moments of brain power for the advertisers. In other words, that is the function of television, to tailor the sensibility for the control and the profit of industry. But perhaps the most spectacular example of how far things have gone and how destructive the universal language of sensibility can be is what has happened to the simple expression shock and awe. Now, if I say shock and awe, or if I'd said shock and awe before 2003, those of us who recognized it would have recognized a reference to the theory of the sublime as formulated by Edmund Burke in the 18th century. The shock destabilizes sensibility. It threatens you with death. You realize that you've survived. The shock is just a spectacle. It's not a real threat to you. And because of that, you feel more powerful. The sublime has the two moments. But with shock and awe now, for many of us, is perhaps the name given by the American administration to the campaign of bombing over Baghdad in the early days of the Iraq War. Now, I don't know who in the Pentagon or in the White House may have read Burke. Probably not very many people. But the question nevertheless remains, who is the sublime spectacle for? And the answer is perfectly simple. The answer is that now that the great powers of the world have precision bombs, you can show the good people of Baghdad walking in the streets that you are powerful enough to kill their oppressors, and that, for example, the sons or nephews or whoever it was of Saddam Hussein can be eliminated in a restaurant in central Baghdad, and that ordinary Iraqis 50 yards away in the street see the spectacle, see their oppressors destroyed, are momentarily terrified, and then realize that this is a show put on for them, and this is meant to enable the birth of what I think is now called officially a young democracy. In the 18th century, between his philosophical inquiry into the origin of ideas of the sublime and the beautiful and his book on the French Revolution, Burke refused to conjoin the terror of the revolution to the aesthetic principles of his inquiry. Now, it seems that we've reached a stage where they can be superimposed without any problem. So on the one hand, it seems to me that the museum as the instrument of the march of reason has run its course. And for example, when the French president says that the creation of a section devoted to Islamic art in the Louvre will act as a message to the deprived people of the Parisian suburbs, for example, and show them that Islam can also be a religion of enlightenment and not just of fundamentalist terror. That is simply obscene. When a candidate for the current French presidential election says that all non-French people, which means non-Europeans, all non-Europeans who want to live in France and acquire French nationality must acknowledge and respect the values of the Enlightenment. That also is obscene because it forgets that the whole history of French colonization was carried out in the name of the Enlightenment. So it seems to me it's very easy nowadays within French culture to show that the myth of the March of Reason was no more than that, was a myth. But on the other hand, the reality of control of our sensibilities, of construction of a normativized subjectivity through the aesthetic, it seems to me, industrially and militarily, is perhaps more effective, stronger than ever. So the question is, if therefore the first stage of the museum has run its course, because the March of Reason is no longer valid, and because the triumph of the aesthetic is basically so terrifying, what can museums do? When the American Air Force transports the museum into the streets of Baghdad with terrifying efficiency, at least in the first place, whereas the French cultural agenda of showing the enlightened aspect, the enlightened dimension of Islam in the Louvre is fated to failure. What can museums do? It seems to me they can do something very specific. The problem today is no longer to deride the myth of reason, which postmodernist thought has done very frequently in a fairly nihilistic way, or which cultural studies have also done all too often in a fairly nihilistic way. That's run out. What is the responsibility of museums? What is the possibility of museums in the age of the triumph of the aesthetic norm? That's a question I think that museums need to answer. And I believe that the answer is to, or one approach at least, is to recall that the aesthetic, if you apply the aesthetic to a notion of the status, the ontological status, if you like, of the work of art, is not the same thing as the aesthetic as the sphere of manipulable sensibility. Significant aesthetic thought of the last couple of hundred years, since the modern sense of aesthetic was invented, has insisted on the autonomy of the work of art. And people like Phillips, the Phillips collection, says that the aesthetic sensibility related to the work of art is not the same thing as the development of the senses, even if afterwards he very quickly reduces the one to the other. So, is it still possible for us to have a notion, a significant notion of the status of the work of art, and can museums contribute to defining this, to reinventing it, and to preserving it? Very quickly, it seems to me that the way to get back to this idea is to remember that when Burke and then Kant, to quote perhaps the strongest names in the 18th century, invented the aesthetic, they put the sublime before the beautiful. And the sublime involves a moment of shock, a moment of disruption, not the smooth incorporation of the sensible into organized behavior, but always the moment of disruption. And it seems to me that works of art, to the extent that they're works of art and not simply exemplary, sensible, sensitive objects, incorporate this strangeness and this effect of shock. If the museum cannot help us to be disturbed by works of art, then the museum will become completely another cog in the normatizing of human sensibility. In other words, the museum will lose its opportunity to be significantly what Foucault calls heterotopias. Heterotopias are spaces, are places in between the normatized networks of human behavior, which can either challenge, reinvent, resist, or be used to re-inject a process of self-subjectivization to the norm. And the work of art must keep its disturbing power if the museum is to remain a positive heterotopia and not simply a safety valve which can re-inject, which helps us to re-inject and to accept and to impose on ourselves social norms. And aesthetic thought since the 18th century has said this very clearly, time and time again. Schiller, in his letters on the aesthetic education of man, speaks of a sculpture of a classical Greek goddess as charming us with her celestial seduction, but also chilling us, frightening us with her celestial self-sufficiency. In other words, that tension which is characteristically attributed to the sublime is also in the beautiful. Or to take a canonical example of thinking on art in the context of technology, Benjamin's notion of aura. If one wants to work seriously with Benjamin on aura, I think one needs to set aside the place where most people look at it. In other words, the essay on the work of art and the age of mechanical reproduction, which is in many ways clumsy, and look rather at Benjamin working on Baudelaire on aura, or Benjamin talking about aura in relation to Proust and to Bergson. Benjamin, in his Baudelaire essay, associates aura with involuntary memory. Voluntary memory, he says, has none of the traces of lived experience. Involuntary memory does. It's Proust's Madeleine. But then Benjamin, rather unfortunately, in my estimation, forgets the fact that lived experience is exiled in the objects of involuntary memory. And he assimilates the experience attaching to the object in involuntary memory to the experience of a tool which has the marks of being handled. In other words, in the tool you see it, and there we go very quickly into certain kind of Heideggerian discourse. And in the object of involuntary memory, you don't see it, you don't feel it. You come across it by chance. You don't understand it. And what Benjamin does, he tries to get rid of the chance element. First of all, by assimilating the object of aura with the art object as an object of aura, apparently, with the tool. And then by saying that the fact that the lived experience is exiled in, unreachable in, the erratic object is simply incidental. It seems to me that collections in museums show quite the opposite. That you come across, you're confronted with, you are caught by, very often unbeknownst to yourself, unwittingly, the strange, satisfying, and some often terrifying self-sufficiency of the work of art. It seems to me, for example, that once again that Benjamin is much closer to what museums can do, not when he discusses the apparent clear historical dynamics of the loss of aura in the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, but in his essay on the task of the translator, where he says the task of the translator is to liberate the pure intensive language, which is the, not meaning, but the possibility of a human community in the work in a foreign language, where it is imprisoned in the work and spellbound in the work. Both of these words are in the task of the translator. And perhaps the task of the museum, if it is to reinvent itself in the age of the triumph of the aesthetic norm, is precisely to let its public, to facilitate for its public the seizure of what is imprisoned, held spellbound in the work of art, rather than suggesting that the work of art, as in traditional pragmatic aesthetic discourse, the work of art helps us to reach, thanks to the privileged experience of the artist with whom one to a certain extent identifies, to experience more fully the life of the senses. And that is, it seems to me, where it becomes useful to appeal to thinkers and writers who are apparently very distanced from aesthetic problems. Emerson, in Self-Reliance, famously, the vision one has of Emerson is precisely everything comes from me. But if you read Self-Reliance carefully, or if you read The American Scholar carefully, it's all about how you handle influence. It's not that we are self-sufficient, but that we must become self-reliant. We must learn to handle influences. And handle influences is not to resist them. At the beginning of Self-Reliance, Emerson says that in a work of genius, our most intimate thoughts rush upon us from outside, and they can only come upon us from outside. It seems to me that there, and in the development of Emerson's thoughts on experience, self-reliance, and culture, in the way that Emerson says that culture for us is a headache. I think that culture in the French sense for us today certainly is a headache. It's a headache for most of the people who go to the Louvre. Even the director of the Louvre admits it. So if culture for us is no longer to be a headache, it means that we must learn to interact with autonomous works of art. We must be prepared to accept that our most intimate thoughts can only come to us from the outside. And therefore that the community building to which works of art can constitute, and which is basically the only serious justification for the existence of museums. Why should countries devote such colossal sums to building museums if it's just to increase the number of tourists? The idea is also, or first of all, that interaction with works of art, is a significant mode of community building. And museums, I think, need to learn to help us to realize that this form of community building is not the reaching out and the learning of a universal language of sense, of sensation, as Dewey would say, as Barnes would say, as Phillips would say, but that it is a learning through what is essentially strange to us. In other words, that there is no possibility of dissolving the aura, which Benjamin sometimes, but rather confusingly perhaps, seems to suggest. So, starting off from a French-American opposition between the March of Reason and the March of Sentiment, rejecting the notion that, as the English would say, as they invented the social and cultural importance of sensibility in the 18th century, that reason, that French reason was the mark of the despot, of the Sun King Louis XIV, whereas the advent of sensibility was the advent of the free subject. Such is the capacity for manipulating, by all sorts of political and technological means today, our sensibilities, that we have very little reason for believing that modern subjectivity is part of a progress in relation to legislation by the law which self-proclaims itself as being synonymous with reason. So having started off from the opposition of reason and the sensible, and suggested that they are partners in the process of the museum emerging as a disciplinary institution. And having suggested that the sensibility, the function of the museum as a device for promoting the sensibility, is not necessarily the liberating institution which perhaps we still are too prepared to think it is. That the sensibility today is terrifying in its efficacy, where the reason has become almost a laughingstock of uninterested posturing. Reason, what the French Enlightenment idea of the reason, has been replaced over the last couple of centuries by a simple power of calculation, which in fact calculates and quantifies, and therefore has learned to normativize sentiment, while setting aside the whole idea that the reason itself is the instrument of progress. So one needs to get back, it seems to me, to thinkers who ask explicitly about what it is to be self-reliant, to repeat Emerson's term, what it is to be a scholar, what it is to negotiate with influence, but in the end to accept that what comes first is perception. But for Emerson, perception, which is very close to what the aestheticians of the 18th century referred to as perception, is something which is, by definition, and irreducibly strange to us. And it's the work of art that can help us do that. And it seems to me to be the function of the museum, of the function of a museum which we still have to invent. After the age of the triumph of the management and control of sensibility, to be a site not only of resistance, but of reinvention of another form of subjectivity. It would be possible to show at greater length how Emerson can contribute to this. My closing question will be, what about the future technological age of the museum? What about the integration of technologies into the museum? If military technology today can give us a fairly abject, sublime spectacle, or give the poor people of Baghdad a really abject, sublime spectacle. If the entertainment industry can more and more efficiently control us by getting us to control our own sensibilities, by addicting us to tailored media. What can technology do in the museum which will not simply accentuate, amplify the movement? And it seems to me that the other dimension, a significant dimension of technological means, which, as Barbara Stafford was saying the other day, is self-organizing, which makes it possible to invent another way of interacting with works of art and with institutions such as the museum than that of cultural learning according to the French model, or the control of sensibility according to the Anglo-American model. In other words, if the work of art is always the other, and if our task as recipients, sharers, translators of artistic experience is to integrate this, then what we need to work on, what we need to develop, what we need basically to invent is a kind of interaction which will allow the development of open-ended interactions which will allow us to perpetually reinvent our culture. In other words, museums need to be not places of formal, democratic formatting of the subjects of the last 2 centuries, let us say, but need to become institutions whereby the participation of people in the ongoing, open-ended definition, individuation of a culture becomes possible. I think I'm running out of time. Am I running out of time? Yeah. So I won't go into any detail about this. My point is that in the work of many or a certain number of theoreticians, of disseminated cognition, disseminate embodied cognition. In the work of a philosopher like Gilbert Simondon, who puts relations, tensions before entities, who develops a theory of individuation, of psychological individual subjects, but also of societies and cultures within a field of forces in which the relations and tensions and the dynamics produce emergent or co-emergent identities, individual identities and social identities. Using the tools of crystallography, but also of molecular biology and of information theory, it seems to me that there is incipient in contemporary philosophy and in some contemporary cognitive science, a model or models of non-alienated, non-controlled, but genuinely emergent, self-identifying cultures. But a philosopher like Simondon points out that the process is an open-ended process, and that individuation automatically involves the separation of something one loses, and that the field is always there, and that there's always a possibility of replaying the game, always forever the possibility of the necessity of continuing the process of individuation. Is it possible for works of art to contribute as challenging, strange, alluring, and simultaneously destabilizing, self-sufficient entities? Is it possible for them to encourage a mode of interaction which will allow us to participate more fully in the individuation of our culture? That, I think, is something which we talked indirectly about in the design studio I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture. And I think it's one of the challenges of the integration of technology into the museum, to make sure that the technology becomes a medium for an open-ended process of reinvention of ourselves and of our culture, and ceases to be a model of basically self-imposed, normativized behavior. In other words, it's important for the museum to become a cog in the development of genuine, participatory, democratic processes, as opposed to the formal, but very often, all too often, meaningless democratic processes, which in our societies, on my side of the Atlantic and on your side of the Atlantic, they too often are. And if it is to be significant to try to introduce new media, new technologies into the world of the museum, it is on these terms, which still have to be invented, and which I, rather too vaguely I fear today, try to sketch out the theoretical reasons, both for the necessity and even more sketchily, the kind of way one might proceed. But I better stop there. Thank you.
I want to thank Yves on behalf, certainly of the High Museum, but also surely of Georgia Tech, for his careful articulation of this set of questions engaged in really unfolding concepts for a new museum. I think that those of us that have been here this evening have seen again, and some of those of us who've had the privilege of spending time with Yves, see how seriously engaged he is in posing these questions for all of us, not simply for one particular intellectual enterprise that one or another of us might be engaged in, but underscoring how, in effect, projects such as Louvre Atlanta and how the multiple projects, in effect, those of us that are engaged with the arts find ourselves dealing with. We're all, in effect, engaged in asking these questions about new concepts for museums of the future. I know Yves was very prepared to answer a few questions, and so at this point I'm going to turn those questions over to you. We're being asked to use the microphone because
yes, please use. It's being taped,
and we look forward to it being broadcast on one of our educational television.
Yes. Are there any questions for Yves? No questions. Yes.
I'm real interested in the, and correct me if I'm wrong a little bit with the Barnes collection, that his collection at the time, like the scholars at the time, kind of discounted it and didn't feel he was a serious, art collector, or the presentation.
Certainly, yeah.
It was really kind of a reaction to the establishment at the time that he did what he did. And you were bringing up the point with the whole idea of he really didn't want it to be a museum. And that's one of the things that I'm intrigued by, is that we seem to be getting caught in the semantics of the word museum. And how do and I'm just wondering if there's some, is it, the word museum and Barnes where, is it a museum or not? And kind of, do you see just completely different approaches that just step completely away from the word or the concept of museum to do, similar interaction?
Well, I've got one here, I think. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, Barnes is an anti-establishment figure. I would say yes and no. What interests me is that the Barnes Foundation predates the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which is one of the great American art museums, in the same way that the Phillips collection, even more dramatically, by some 20 years, predates the National Gallery of Art in Washington. So it seems to me that what people like Barnes were doing, Barnes more militantly in many ways than Phillips, but Phillips also, what they were doing was anticipating a model of what the culture called museums, even if Barnes refused, as far as he was concerned, to call it a museum, was anticipate, and they were inventing a new, or apparently a new form of cultural institution, which Phillips was happy enough to call a museum, and Barnes didn't want to call it a museum. That's the first point. It interests me that they anticipate the major public art historical museums in their immediate vicinity. So it seems to me that that's something that's important going on there. That's the first point. The second point is that perhaps in the question of what people were saying about museums then, and certainly what people in France are still saying about museums, they're doing something which is anti-establishment or revolutionary. But basically what they're doing is that they are implementing and amplifying one of the two strands that seems to me to have always been important in the history of museums since the 18th, 19th century. In other words, the forming of the sensibility as opposed to the advance of the march of reason. So yes, I mean, they are anti-establishment in terms of the ideological debates of their time. They are revolutionary or ahead of their times, if only in the way that their institutions predate the big public museums in their respective cities. But what they're doing basically is amplifying and perhaps purifying one of the two major strands of what museums had been doing ever since they'd been invented. If museums were invented in the 18th and developed in the 19th century, if the museum is different from the private collections of previous ages, if the kings of France, who are across the other side of the campus here, Louis XIV, Louis XV, and Louis XVI, were collectors, they were not collectors in the sense of museum collectors. And cabinets of curiosity were not museum collections either. And it seems to me that one of the important, the invention of the museum is important. It has long been identified in France, because the museum is basically a revolutionary invention in France, as instrumental in the emancipation of man through the March of Reason. But it seems to me that the museum, to the extent that it is almost simultaneous with the invention of the modern notion of the aesthetic, has always also been, at least potentially, about, or an instrument of, working on, and I would say normalizing, the sensibility. So to that extent, that Barnes and Phillips in the 1920s were purifying, bringing out a strand that had always been in the part of the dynamics of the museum since collections had become museums. Not the French strand, but I think the Anglo-American strand. I mean, it's almost reductive to use national labels for that. But I think that these two strands can very largely be identified with French ideology, the French religion of reason, and English empiricism and American pragmatism. So I think that the time dimension is perhaps more complex than simply anti-establishment. I think they're forerunners. To a certain extent, terror and so shock and awe is a logical development from Barnes and Phillips, which is what, I mean, you can't reduce the Barnes and Phillips to anticipators and facilitators of shock and awe in Baghdad in 2003. But there is a strand there. And that's the other aspect of the question that I'm concerned with, obviously.
Do we have another question?
Hi. I really enjoyed your talk. It seems to me that sorry, I wrote this down so that I can actually do it. So, experience of a work of art is different also based on the emotional and intellectual energy that the viewer brings to the work of art. And so my question is, how can a museum facilitate the individualization of culture at the same time that it creates a sense of community? I would be interested in your thoughts on that.
Okay, well, Edmund Burke would say that the sublime corresponds to the passion of self-preservation, and that the beautiful corresponds to the social passions, and that the need for self-preservation comes before the social passions. Okay? In other words, that the individual experience precedes the social experience. Okay? He would then go on to say, or Kant would say it even more precisely, that the beautiful basically is not interesting because it's simply an average. And Kant comes very close to saying that the beautiful is no more than the statistical average of what people feel. I mean, Kant has the image of the ideal of how you define an ideal height. You define an ideal height by superimposing a whole lot of silhouettes, and where the color is most intense, that is but that's simply the average. Okay, and Burke is very close in places to saying that the beautiful is no more than consensual aesthetics. Okay, and that's when I'm saying that there's a way of manipulating the sensibility which is normative. That sort of demonstration is, as Kant's demonstration, proves that, because what is the beautiful in that case? The beautiful is the average. Beautiful is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay? That you are right if most people agree with you. Okay? It's exactly the same sort of thing as you have in many television programs in France, and I suspect in the States as well. In France, when there's a big soccer or rugby match, they ask viewers to vote for the best player in the match. And one of the viewers who is right, in other words, who falls in with the average, wins a prize. Okay? So in other words, as soon as you have that sort of approach, the beautiful becomes a self-normativizing, self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think that museums nearly have contributed to that in a fairly major way over the last 2 or 3 centuries, last couple of centuries. Okay, so that is the obvious risk. Okay? So, is it possible for an institution to function democratically, but not statistically? Okay? I think that was basically the question I was asking of the students in the design studio that we were working in the fall. Okay? Can we today invent media which function in a disseminated way, but do not reduce things to a norm, and typically to a statistical norm? Okay, but if you're asking me if I have an answer or if I regard it as a challenge, I would say that for the moment I regard it very much as a challenge. But I think it's a challenge we have to face. Otherwise, we will all be happily trying to be even more normal than our neighbors. And surely museums do not exist to make us strive to be more normal than whoever is standing next to us looking at the painting. But that's the risk. I'm sure that cultural mediation in the French sense is utterly useless for that. Okay? And when I listen to what people say, what docents say as they guide people around American museums, I'm not sure that they're very much better than the French. They're certainly not worse, that's for sure. I mean, that would be pretty difficult. But I'm not sure that it does not come down to a common. In fact, what someone like Phillips or Barnes would call a universal language of art is simply the common language of art. What Walter Benjamin calls pure language is not the common language of art or of literature. Okay? And it's that is difficulty. I think you can't do it by the means that are used nowadays, and without having any obvious faith in the power of new technological means. I think that
I'm real interested in the and correct me if I'm wrong a little bit with the Barnes collection, that his collection at the time, like the scholars at the time, kind of discounted it and didn't feel he was a serious, art collector, or the presentation.
Certainly, yeah.
It was really kind of a reaction to the establishment at the time that he did what he did. And you were bringing up the point with the whole idea of he really didn't want it to be a museum. And that's one of the things that I'm intrigued by, is that we seem to be getting caught in the semantics of the word museum. And how do we, and I'm just wondering if there's some, is it, the word museum and Barnes where, is it a museum or not? And kind of, do you see just completely different approaches that just step completely away from the word or the concept of museum to do similar interaction?
Well, I've got one here, I think. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, Barnes is an anti-establishment figure. I would say yes and no. What interests me is that the Barnes Foundation predates the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which is one of the great American art museums, in the same way that the Phillips collection, even more dramatically, by some 20 years, predates the National Gallery of Art in Washington. So it seems to me that what people like Barnes were doing, Barnes more militantly in many ways than Phillips, but Phillips also, what they were doing was anticipating a model of what the culture called museums, even if Barnes refused, as far as he was concerned, to call it a museum, was anticipate, and they were inventing a new, or apparently a new form of cultural institution, which Phillips was happy enough to call a museum, and Barnes didn't want to call it a museum. That's the first point. It interests me that they anticipate the major public art historical museums in their immediate vicinity. So it seems to me that that's something that's important going on there. That's the first point. The second point is that perhaps in the question of what people were saying about museums then, and certainly what people in France are still saying about museums, they're doing something which is anti-establishment or revolutionary. But basically what they're doing is that they are implementing and amplifying one of the two strands that seems to me to have always been important in the history of museums since the 18th, 19th century. In other words, the forming of the sensibility as opposed to the advance of the march of reason. So yes, they are anti-establishment in terms of the ideological debates of their time. They are revolutionary or ahead of their times, if only in the way that their institutions predate the big public museums in their respective cities. But what they're doing basically is amplifying and perhaps purifying one of the two major strands of what museums had been doing ever since they'd been invented. If museums were invented in the 18th and developed in the 19th century, if the museum is different from the private collections of previous ages, if the kings of France, who are across the other side of the campus here, Louis XIV, Louis XV, and Louis XVI, were collectors. They were not collectors in the sense of museum collectors. And cabinets of curiosity were not museum collections either. And it seems to me that one of the important, the invention of the museum is important. It has long been identified in France because the museum is basically a revolutionary invention in France as instrumental in the emancipation of man through the march of reason. But it seems to me that the museum, to the extent that it is almost simultaneous with the invention of the modern notion of the aesthetic, has always also been, at least potentially, about, or an instrument of, working on, and I would say normalizing, the sensibility. So to that extent, the Barnes and Phillips in the 1920s were purifying, bringing out a strand that had always been in the part of the dynamics of the museum since collections had become museums. Not the French strand, but I think the Anglo-American strand. I mean, it's always reductive to use national labels for that. But I think that these two strands can very largely be identified with French ideology, the French religion of reason, and English empiricism and American pragmatism. So I think that the time dimension is perhaps more complex than simply anti-establishment. I think they're forerunners. To a certain extent, terror and shock and awe is a logical development from Barnes and Phillips, which is what, I mean, you can't reduce the Barnes and Phillips to anticipators and facilitators of shock and awe in Baghdad in 2003. But there is a strand there. And that's the other aspect of the question that I'm concerned with, obviously.